If you've been training in a Cessna 172, there's an extremely high chance that eventually you're going to transition out of that and into something bigger and maybe arguably better, right? But the 172 is awesome. But that's not the only airplane you're ever going to fly, and things are going to change when you move into a different airplane. I know when I bought my Cessna 182, most of my time up through that point was in a 172, a Super Cub, and I had a little bit of 182 time. But I remember getting in the cockpit and landing it for the first time. It had been a while since I flew a 182, and I thought, whoa, we are not in Kansas anymore. As you transition or look to transition into new aircraft, there's definitely gonna be some differences as you kind of move out of a typically more training type aircraft and into maybe a higher performance airplane. And so I think you can boil the differences down to a few key areas. And those differences are aircraft systems, flight characteristics, and performance. So for systems, there's a couple things here, but I would say probably the biggest and most unanimous change that you will experience leaving a 172 and going into a 182 or something else is the introduction of a constant speed prop. So as you've been flying your 172 and throttle is RPMs and that's all that there is, you're gonna kind of introduce a new dynamic where you have manifold pressure and your prop control and your RPM settings, right? And so at first this can feel a little bit foreign, but honestly, if you've ever gone from like an automatic transmission vehicle to a manual transmission, you can totally do this because it's way easier than that. You're not actually having to change gears. Or even if you used to ride a fixed gear bicycle when you were little and then you moved to a mountain bike or something, you're like, oh, I got gears that work more optimally in different situations. That's pretty much what a constant speed propeller is doing. And so once you kind of get those down, honestly, it's super, super manageable. But pretty much if you're gonna go into anything more high performing than a 172, you're definitely gonna have a constant speed prop, but it's super easy. Don't be intimidated by that. Another difference might be a retractable landing gear. I still have fixed gear on my 182, but as you get into bigger and bigger aircraft, they start to become more retractable in nature. And so you'll have to get used to that, just kind of difference in your checklist and kind of your pre-landing flow and such, but honestly, not a huge deal. Another difference you might have is cowl flaps, but they don't do anything, they just sit there. So, just another checklist item, another thing to kind of manage and cruise. To help manage your temperatures, it does give you a little boost in airspeed there when you close them, but you do have to manage the engine temps when you do close them, but super easy. Like none of this is rocket science whatsoever. And then if you get into much more complex airplanes, you might have the introduction of new systems like pressurization or de-ice, or there might be a new complicated fuel system, instead of just a nice easy gravity fed tanks that are, fuel on both, baby, and you don't have to manage it or anything from a 172. So just kind of depends on what you're moving into. But the good thing is you'll get trained in these new aircraft. There's going to be checklist items for all of these things. It's just not rocket science. So you just kind of need to know moving on a 172, there's going to be some new things to learn, but if I can learn it, you can definitely learn it. It's not going to be a huge deal. I would say the constant speed prop is probably the guarantee that you have probably moving into most new airplanes. But again, that's really not hard to learn. After a few hours, you'll be just fine. As for flight characteristics, if you're moving from a 172 to a 182, like I was, honestly, it really just flies like a bigger, heavier, faster 172. It's a lot like moving from like a Tahoe to a Suburban, although I don't know that I'd compare a Tahoe to a 172, but maybe like moving from like a Civic to an Accord or something. Like you can just tell you have more weight, you can tell you have more power, you can tell it's a little bit heavier, that kind of stuff. But there are a few areas of these flight characteristics that will definitely be different, whether you're doing a 182 or something else, so they're worth going through. One of the first things I noticed coming out of the 172 and into the 182 was the landing characteristics, and specifically the nose felt quite a bit heavier. It makes sense, there's a bigger engine up there, there's more weight and stuff, so that took a little bit getting used to. There's more up front, right? But trim is absolutely your friend here. I've learned in any aircraft, you can pretty much trim it to about whatever airspeed you want and then just use throttle for your altitude and descent rate. You also don't float as much. A 182 can definitely float. Like if you bring an extra airspeed, you're just gonna float down the runway, but not all airplanes are like that. I remember when I was flying in an Aero, Piper Arrow to get my retract time for my commercial, I remember like when you pull the power on that thing, like it's got the little short, you know, Hershey wings and stuff, and like it's not a floater, at least not in my experience. And so like a 172, you can kind of get used to that ground effect and have the nice cushy kind of float, which is sometimes not what you want because it makes it harder to land short if you're carrying extra airspeed. But a lot of aircraft won't be that gentle, aren't going to float all that much, and so landing can just be a little bit different in that regard. Another difference you might notice is just in the forgiveness characteristics of the airplane. A 172 is the best trainer in the world because of how forgiving it is, right? You got that nice dihedral in the wing that just will like self-correct, you know, the airplane. You know, in a turn, it wants to kind of come back to steady level flight. If you put it in descent, you know, it just kind of steadies itself. It likes to just fly itself. It's a really great airplane, but not all other airplanes are like that. And so it might not be as forgiving in other airplanes. Stall characteristics or you know, a place that this would come up. So the 172 usually has a pretty nice gentle stall, you know, unless you're getting a really steep power on stall, you can get it to kind of brake a little bit more aggressively, but more aircraft will be a little bit more dramatic in the stall. I remember flying with my dad in his Bonanza back in the day, and that had a little bit more drama associated with it. Like you can start to feel kind of the buffet a little bit, and it tends to brake a little bit harder. It's just different than a 172. So the characteristics and just the forgiveness and the self-correction and everything, like the 172 has become so famous for a lot of reasons, and that's definitely one of its strongest points, that it loves to be an easy to fly airplane, and not all other aircraft are like that. They're not as forgiving as the 172. One of the more enjoyable differences is that you're pretty much always going to have more power if flying anything other than a 172, like moving up into a 182 or Bonanza or something different. Like you got way more horsepower, and you can totally feel it. Like on takeoff, you know, whenever you put in the power, for me, it's like if you put in about, you know, 2/3 of the power or so, like that's your 172 type power, and then you put in that last third and you're like, oh, okay, now we're in a 182. Like you can just feel it. It's a great feeling knowing that you've got more up front helping you, but you can't let that get to your head and just think, I'm invincible, I've got more power, I can do anything, I can get out of, you know, more situations and stuff, because the aircraft is bigger and heavier and it needs that extra power, right? So you still have to run, you know, do everything by the book, run the numbers on your takeoffs performance and everything, so you don't just have power for days, right? But it's a good feeling as a pilot just to have a little bit more out there in front of you. So to sum up flight characteristics, if you're moving from a 172 to a 182, really the 182 just flies like a bigger, heavier, faster, more well-powered 172. It's a really, really easy transition. Landings are going to be a little bit different. You know, the flight characteristics and stalls and things might be a little bit different, but it's super, super manageable. So nothing really to worry about, but you will notice a difference. So in terms of performance, if you're upgrading out of a 172, really two things come to mind that you're gonna get to enjoy, and that's speed and useful load. Particularly if you're going into a 182, you're definitely gonna get a bump in both of those things, and it's awesome, let's just be honest. So as far as speed, you know, if you get another 20, 30 knots, like that's awesome. But what I will say is that in my 182, like if I've been flying with some of my friends in a 172, and we've been doing kind of some airport hopping or something, if we're going 50 miles, 100 miles, something like that, like it's not a huge difference. It's not like I'm getting there twice as fast, because you're just not going far enough really for that speed difference to really be significant. If you're gonna go 1,000 miles, you know, across state lines or something, then that definitely adds up. But it's not like you're all of a sudden in a rocket. So like you get to definitely appreciate the speed, but it's not a huge game changer. But if you're going to like a Bonanza or a Cirrus or like a fast RV or something, like you're getting an extra 70 knots of airspeed, 60, 70 plus knots, that starts to add up for sure. So you could do the math based on your average, you know, distance and see how much quicker you'll get there. But again, you don't just get like half the day back again because you're getting there that much faster. But it's an appreciable increase in speed. On the other hand though, sometimes the speed, you know, there's another factor to that. Like if you're gonna go fly a Mooney or something, I haven't flown a Mooney myself, but I've heard they can be kind of difficult to slow down. They're very, very fast and they don't have a ton of drag. And so like trying to slow it down to get into the pattern or get the landing, I hear you really have to plan ahead. And so the speed is kind of a double-edged sword there, where it starts to also create some performance differences for you that impact kind of the way you do different phases of flight and things. But in general, you're gonna fly faster, it's gonna be fun. So you'll also get a boost in useful load, how much you can carry, right? It's certainly if you're moving to a 182. And that's been the biggest difference for me that I've noticed that I've really been able to utilize is being able to carry more, right? Like for one, a 182 is an honest 4-place airplane. You can really put 4 people in it and fly. You can do that with a 172, but very, very carefully, right? They have to be the right people.
Think skinny people.
But like a 182, like you've got plenty to work with there. And so I've really enjoyed that, been able to use it in a lot of different scenarios, either use a ton of fuel or carry a lot of bags or gear or something or people. You just have more to work with, which is really, really awesome. But don't fall victim to, the saying that like with a 182 or a 206 or something, maybe a 206 has this a little bit more, but the saying that if you can get the door closed, the thing will fly. And so just like any airplane, you got to run the numbers, right? You got to do the weight and balance. Like I can overload my airplane for sure. It's not that hard, but like compared to a 172, you've got way more to work with, and I love having a higher useful load. So to sum up performance, you will really, really appreciate the extra, 30% horsepower or so moving up to a 182. You will notice it. I think you'll enjoy it, and you're going to enjoy the extra useful load. But if you aren't going faster, one thing I would just note here is one of my aviation mentors has always told me like, hey, why do you got to go fast? You're trying to build time. Like if you're going to go 20 knots slower and get an extra 0.4 hours or something on the way, then that's great. That's 0.4 hours that you needed. And so, like if I'm not going bonanza speed or something, I've learned to be okay with that because it's more time in the air. It's great. It's time that I'm trying to build anyways. And so you don't always have to go fast just for the sake of going fast. But I will say, if you are upgrading out of the 172, you probably will go faster. You'll be able to carry more, and it's just fun. So between systems, some different flight characteristics, and hopefully some improved performance, really moving out of a 172 is no big deal. There's be some new things to learn, some new checklist items, some new muscle memory to create, but all very, very doable. And so those are some of the things I've learned, moving out of the 172 myself. Also, speaking of things I've learned, I've done a lot of reflecting, trying to figure out, some of the most impactful lessons that I've learned over the last 16 years of my aviation journey. And I wanted to find a way to kind of summarize that in a way that I could, help other aviators. And so I have put that together in case you haven't heard about it. And you can actually get that over at airplaneacademy.com/join. It's a 5-day email series where I wrap kind of my most impactful aviation lessons, the good ones that I've learned, the bad ones based on my own mistakes that I've learned, through training, through airplane ownership, through buying an airplane, and all of that. And it's in 5 days. It's 5 emails, and I hope that it'll be a resource to you. So it's totally free. Feel free to sign up for it over at airplaneacademy.com/join, and I hope that it'll be helpful to you. And then also, I'd love to see you in the comments section, particularly if you've already transitioned out of a 172 into something else. Like, what are some of the other differences you've noticed outside of those that I already mentioned? I think it'll be a really rich discussion as always. So I can't wait to talk to you down there. So thanks for watching, guys. Hope it's helpful to you, and I'll see you next week.